Alrighty, so I want to start off today by just giving a little bit of an explanation why I haven't released a video in a few days. So as I mentioned in my previous vid, I was getting a little sick, so I was getting a cough and everything. It ended up it wasn't like, it didn't end up getting like really bad, but I did end up coughing a lot, so it made it very hard to record. So what I figured instead was that I'd use the time to work on my other channel, Starson versus the Arts, as it's currently called. There will be a link in the description to finish my first review, which is going to be for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So I've been trying to, balance all that with working a job because currently this isn't, my job, obviously, but, at one point I would like it to be. But as it stands right now, I got to balance the two. So I've been using a lot of that time to work on that. So I figured what a better time to come back than for the second presidential debate of 2016. So coming into it, my thoughts of it were basically that this could be the killing blow for Trump because while I was gone, we had the whole Trump scandal with Access Hollywood where he was recorded making lewd comments about women, basically admitting that he performed or that he would actively engage in sexual assaults on women, and he knew that he could get away with it because he was popular, he was famous, and that basically kind of is imploding his campaign right now. So last night could have been the death blow, and going into it, I was very excited to see that death blow. But the question is whether or not that ended up actually happening. So this video is going to be a little bit different from my last debate video. Instead of just talking about who won, I'm actually going to do a bit of a review of all the significant points of the entire debate. So it's going to be longer, and I hope it's going to be a little bit more interesting. So to start things off, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton enter the stage, and they do something a little interesting. Oh boy, do they hate each other. There was no freaking way a handshake was going on there. You could see it into their eyes. Trump in particular looked like he wanted to eat Hillary Clinton, and I think he really did because he spent the entire rest of the night trying to eat his microphone. Throughout the entire night, you could hear all those sniffles from the first one return because he holds his mic up to his face like that, and you can hear every single solitary breath he takes, like we're listening to this from front row seats inside Donald Trump's throat. It was very, very annoying to listen to his audio, and I wish he would just pull that back a little bit. But in any case, let's go. What's the first question that these guys have for them? Is it going to be about money in politics, climate change, ISIS? What is it?
Our first question comes from Patrice Brock. Patrice?
Thank you and good evening. The last presidential debate could have been rated as MA, mature audiences, per TV parental guidelines. Knowing that educators assign viewing the presidential debates as students' homework, do you feel you are modeling appropriate and positive behavior for today's youth?
Think of the children. That's really what we're going to start this debate off with. What does it matter if their behavior during that was a model for children? Because the point of these debates is to talk about real issues, and real issues in the US in real life are oftentimes violent. Oftentimes they are for mature audiences. Are we supposed to dumb down these debates for the sake of kids doing homework? Kids are supposed to and should be being introduced to this stuff. If people don't want them to see real issues, they don't want to see discussion about, horrific war crimes in Syria, economic problems here, racial issues in the U.S., then don't assign them for the debates. But I mean, not that that really matters, because ultimately we do get dumbed down discussion at these presidential debates, but that's like, I don't need, that's such a stupid question. And I think almost Donald Trump and Hillary thought it was stupid, because I don't know what was more asinine, that question or the 10 or so minutes I had to endure of Donald Trump and Hillary faking answering that question by vaguely addressing children in a speech and then going on about talking about how America's great or economic problems and all this stuff that didn't really relate to the original question. But it was just, that was the way to start off this debate. I was not happy. I was very angered that this woman was even allowed to say that this woman's question was allowed to enter in the field at all. This was such an amazing waste of time. But what's next on the presidential debate to-do list?
We received a lot of questions online, Mr. Trump, about the tape that was released on Friday. As you can imagine, you called what you said locker room banter. You described kissing women without consent, grabbing their genitals. That is sexual assault. You bragged that you have sexually assaulted women. Do you understand that?
No, I didn't say that at all. I don't think you understood what was said. This was locker room talk. I'm not proud of it. I apologize to my family. I apologize to the American people. Certainly, I'm not proud of it. But this is locker room talk. You know, when we have a world where you have ISIS chopping off heads, where you have, and frankly, drowning people in steel cages, where you...
Blah, blah, blah. Avoid or say random stuff in order to avoid answering the question. But let's address what he actually did talk about when it comes to this video. So he mentions that it's just locker room banter. Locker room banter would be okay if it's just, you know, to the extent of, hey, look at that chick, she's got a nice rack, she's got a nice ass, you know, stuff like that. It's fine. It's, you know, you can argue whether or not it's respectful, but it's not at the same level as talking about sexual assault. And that's what he did. If we hear what he's talking about, he's talking specifically how he has a tendency to just kiss women randomly without consent, to grope them, and that he can get away with it because he's famous. And in the video itself, we see he talks about, he likes the Tic Tacs when he's about to talk to women, because he'll just start kissing them for no reason and without consent. Or not for no reason, for, you know, horny reasons, but without consent. And immediately as he gets off the bus, after he eats this, he's talking to a female publicist, Nancy, and they manage to, in the course of the conversation, they try to get her to kiss the Donald. Both Bush and Donald participate in this. So you can see within this actual video, it has a little bit of a shady aspect to it, because you can see that they were trying to do it literally right on that tape. But he also has other sexual assault allegations against him. His ex-wife, Ivana Trump, has published assault allegations in her book. It was Lost Tycoon, The Many Lives of Donald J. Trump. And granted, it should be noted that all these allegations have not been proven in court yet. But, you know, in the wake of what we're hearing now, it is certainly interesting to note. So she's noted that there was an instance when, in a fit of rage, he raped her, but then his lawyers made her put a thing at the beginning of the book that basically said that rape wasn't being used in a criminal sense in the book. I'm not really sure what that means, but I guess it just basically meant that she was saying rape in a way that she just felt violated. So I guess it's like, you know, I feel raped. It's more of like a metaphorical thing that she's claiming. But she's still saying that she's been violated, so she's still sticking to her guns about there being sexual assault. There's also the issue with Jill Harth, which was a business partner that Trump was working with, and her and her romantic partner were actually invited to his estate at his Florida estate, Mar-a-Lago, and while both her husband was in her and her husband were in the house, Trump got her to go to one of his children's bedrooms, where allegedly he advanced on her, and she had to physically push him away and get him away and scream to get him off of her. So there's that. There's also the recent lawsuit that was filed in New York. It was by a Jane Doe, so I presume that means that she was not identified unless her name is Jane Doe for some reason, which would be very interesting, in which it's basically an accusation that Trump raped a 13-year-old girl. So again, these are not proven, but in the wake of this tape, which, mind you, all of these allegations came from before these tapes were released. So it's telling of Donald. It's certainly brings into question whether or not this truly was locker room banter. So what's next?
Michelle Obama. I've gotten to see the commercials that they did on you. And I've gotten to see some of the most vicious commercials I've ever seen of Michelle Obama talking about you, Hillary. So you talk about friend. Go back and take a look at those commercials. A race where you lost, fair and square, unlike the Bernie Sanders race where you won, but not fair and square, in my opinion.
So it was really around here that I felt that Trump kind of went from when he first came in. I thought he looked like he just did not want to be there. He was tired, he was exhausted and everything, to when he kind of became, I guess, more into what was going on. And at this point, he actually was doing very well. So him hitting Hillary on calling Michelle Obama a friend when everyone in the United States can see how vicious of a campaign the Obamas ran against Hillary and Hillary ran against Obama is really good, because that's simple. The average American, and this is why Trump does so well with a lot of people, because he doesn't talk in this way that requires you to have an understanding of politics about what's going on in the world. You can be any person, see a campaign ad from 2012, and see how just vicious it was. And then when she goes 4 years later and starts talking about how Michelle Obama is such a great friend to her, that creates a huge dissonance there, where it really doesn't make sense, and it kind of exposes, the corruption and the strangeness of politics, where you can go from being bitter enemies to just because now the person's elected, so now they're great friends. So this helps Trump with his whole campaign goal of trying to make Hillary look like just a corrupt politician. And he also did a great job here of bringing Bernie back into this. So one of Hillary's biggest flaws is the fact that she has such a split base. And one of the biggest splits there is who were formerly Bernie supporters. Only 52% of Bernie supporters were planning on voting for Hillary, and that's a huge split. That's almost literally half of the of that nominee's group just not potentially not even voting for their own party anymore. So this helps Trump try to split that base even more. The question is whether or not it's a little bit too little too late. I think it might be, because at this point Trump's had so much stuff come out about him. And to be fair, Hillary has too. But the thing with Trump's scandals is they're very simple to understand, like how he speaks. Ironically, Trump's greatest strength as a candidate is also potentially his greatest weakness. So his greatest strength is he's simple. You don't have to know about politics to understand what he's talking about. So his messages get out easily, uneducated, uninformed, not caring. All these people who are the vast majority of the American people, it's more so the uninformed. I'm not saying vast majority of Americans are uneducated. And so that's how his messages can spread. But the thing is when he has a scandal, his scandals are something like he talks about sexual assault casually with not really a friend, but a business partner and stuff like this. And you don't have to, like with Hillary, she has a leak. So with Hillary, in order to kind of get the full damage from her leaks, you have to go in read her full transcripts of her Goldman Sachs speech, listen to the audio from that private donor speech, and then really understand what's going on there. Because to a lot of people, they're not going to listen to it. They're not going to understand it fully. So it becomes a lot harder, at least this is, in my opinion, for Hillary scandals to affect her to the extent that Trump's do. Now, obviously Hillary's unliked, and I think that that's mainly due to just a conglomeration of all the scandals that have kind of happened around her. It's created a general perception of her just being unlikable, and she just presents herself as pretty unlikable. She doesn't seem like a real person. So I think a lot of it is perception, and then the informed people come in, learn about what Hillary's done, and then they also help spread that word. So it's a combination of things, but with Trump, this is why I think that like Trump has a scandal and then his poll numbers go whoop, whereas Hillary's still will go down potentially, but they don't go that down because not as many people understand it. But this is good. This is what Trump is good at, is bringing to light simple truths, really. Well, not necessarily truths. That was the wrong word. But when he speaks, what people will perceive as truths, and then they're simple, and then they get around. And then talking about Bernie, talking about how victimized Bernie was by the Democratic Party, is great to try to split Bernie voters even more. However, he also went on to say that he doesn't get why Bernie signed on with the devil. I don't know how great that is as a response or as a statement, because I feel like that kind of almost puts some blame on Bernie. And I guess there's obviously a lot of people who do blame Bernie for signing on with Hillary. But at the same time, it's also like you went from him being a victim to also him signing on with the enemy. So it's a little bit of a mixed message, I feel like, because obviously Trump doesn't actually care. He's just using it to try to get Bernie voters. So, and then Hillary didn't really have a great response for all this, because it's true. The Obamas did run a vicious campaign against her. She did run a vicious campaign against the Obamas. Specifically in terms of the birtherism, it came from Hillary's camp because they cycled those photos of Obama in that, the native garb to try to spark that. Trump went ahead and went with it, but they still sparked it. So it becomes very difficult. She can't really deny these things happen. So she doesn't really have a response. Same thing with Bernie. I mean, it was great when Trump brought up Debbie Wasserman Schultz. I hate Trump, but I also hate Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So anytime Debbie Wasserman Schultz is put into the media in any negative light is good for me. And for a lot of people who do know Debbie Wasserman Schultz is, in fact, I don't really know who likes Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who also knows who she is. But I think that that's good because it brings into focus that whole narrative of she's the ultimate insider, which is true. So, but it's talking about what Trump's goal is, about how she's the ultimate insider and how her party and her group, her elitist group, rigged the system against the American people, against against their enemies. So definitely, this was actually very good, and I thought Trump really started to pick up steam.
About health care, Ken?
I'd like to know, Anderson, why aren't you bringing up the emails? I'd like to know. Why aren't you
We
getting
brought up
to the
the
bottom?
emails.
No, it hasn't. It hasn't. And it hasn't been finished at all.
Ken Karpowitz has a question.
It's nice to 1-on-3.
Trump was not helping himself with how he was acting, though, that night, where he was a big baby. Everything was rigged. In that instance, he sounded like he was about to cry. Ooh, they're cheating. It's 1-on-3. It's ridiculous how he acts like this the second any opposition comes his way. But talking about him calling out Anderson Cooper for not mentioning the emails, this was maybe 2 or 3 questions into the debate. And by that point, Trump had already gone on like a 10-minute rant about the emails. So I'm not really sure that he has the right to immediately say, oh, why aren't you bringing this up after I wasted almost half of the time so far talking about this. Not even necessarily a waste. You can bring up the emails. It's a good point. In fact, Trump actually, one of his strongest points again was hammering her on the emails. Last debate, she kind of got away with basically just apologizing for the emails, just being like, I'm wrong. But Trump didn't really let her get away with it this time. He was saying that, you know, how careless it was, how incompetent it was, how she had already gotten this subpoena to stop using the server, and then she deleted a bunch of emails. You know, he was hammering her on all this stuff, so that was good. But then he just kind of makes himself look to be this big baby because not everyone is bowing down to him in the debate. So I don't think he helped himself with this, but at the same time, he did bring up good points about the emails. And Hillary's, again, her response to really all this was so poor because a lot of this she responded to, go to my website for fact checking. Hillary, if people actually went on, like the majority of people went on and fact checked, do you think Trump would be doing anywhere near as well as he is? I mean, I know he's not right now losing pretty heavily to you, but do you think that literally if everyone fact checked everything Donald Trump said, that he would be as far as he is? He lies every 5 seconds. So I don't know why your response to that is, hey, guys, go check facts. Because they're not doing it. You already know they're not doing it, so call them out. This is your chance to call Donald Trump out, so do it. I don't understand what the logic is from Hillary.
Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, it is not affordable. Premiums have gone up, deductibles have gone up, co-pays have gone up, prescriptions have gone up, and the coverage has gone down. What will you do to bring the costs down and make coverage better?
When the Affordable Care Act passed, it wasn't just that 20 million people got insurance who didn't have it before, but that in and of itself was a good thing. I meet these people all the time, and they tell me what a difference having that insurance meant to them and their families. But everybody else, the 170 million of us who get health insurance through our employers, got big benefits. Number one, insurance companies can't deny you coverage because of a pre-existing condition. Number two, no lifetime limits, which is a big deal if you have serious health problems. Number three, women can't be charged more than men for our health insurance, which is the way it used to be before the Affordable Care Act. Number four, if you're under 26 and your parents have a policy, you can be on that policy until the age of 26, something that didn't happen before. So I want very much to save what works and is good about the Affordable Care Act. But we've got to get costs down. We've got to provide some additional help to small businesses so that they can afford to provide health insurance. But if we repeal it, as Donald has proposed, and start over again, all of those benefits I just mentioned are lost to everybody.
So yeah, this is actually a pretty good answer, I thought, by Hillary to what was a pretty loaded question by that guy who basically just phrased it as Obamacare is a disaster. And she managed to bring it back and, you know, really bring in the perspective that, yeah, it does have problems, but we're a lot better off than what we had before. We don't have pre-existing conditions anymore. Women and men get to pay equal for their health insurance and all these benefits that Obamacare did actually bring to the table. And the thing is that Trump does just say to repeal it. And his logic is that we're going to have the free market decide. We're going to have bring in competition, and that'll drive prices down. That doesn't really work for something like health insurance, because health insurance is something you kind of have to have because it's your livelihood at stake if you don't have it. If you get into an accident without health insurance, you're kind of screwed there. So it's something you kind of have to sign on for, so it doesn't really work the same way as standard consumer market. As if you go to a store, stores compete with each other, regular businesses compete with each other. On top of that, health insurance companies have motivation to get you signed on, but they don't really have motivation to actually pay to help you once you're signed on. So that's why stuff like pre-existing conditions existed before, was because if you say you had cancer or something that put you at some sort of bigger health risk to the company, which meant that if you signed on to the company, it was more likely that you'd actually use the health insurance and that they would actually have to pay. That's why they would charge you more. That's not, there's no competition there because none of these companies want pre-existing condition people, because that just means that it ends up costing them money. So competition doesn't really work for these industries. That's why we need stuff like, we need either single payer or a public option. That way they have to compete with, for example, a public option. That way the private industry would actually have to compete with the public sector, and that it would be competing with a sector that's not profit driven. Therefore, they'd actually have to start considering stuff like, all right, are we going to eliminate pre-existing conditions and all these various things that they don't have to worry about when it's the private sector, because nobody wants that in the private sector. So when you bring in the public and make it so that they have to compete, they actually have to start considering bringing those options to the table.
There are 3.3 million Muslims in the United States, and I'm one of them. You've mentioned working with Muslim nations, but with Islamophobia on the rise, how will you help people like me deal with the consequences of being labeled as a threat to the country after the election is over?
Mr. Trump, you're first.
Well, you're right about Islamophobia, and that's a shame. But one thing we have to do is we have to make sure that, because there is a problem. I mean, whether we like it or not, and we can be very politically correct.
So Trump pretty much responded to this like you think he would, where he just kind of was like, oh, I'm sorry for Islamophobia, but ban all Muslims. There's a problem. We can't be PC about it. So, that's his response, and obviously it doesn't really make sense. But I'd kind of like to use this to kind of as an example to talk about why ultimately I think that Trump's going to have been considered to have won this debate. So why? He hasn't really talked about policy substance, and Hillary's certainly doing a much better job of that, and she did a much better job of that during this debate. But the thing is that as we see from when Hillary actually responds to Trump, she points out all this stuff, Muslim ban, and everything else about how he helps create Islamophobia, how a lot of what he says is used by ISIS in their recruitment videos, so that he's actually basically a tool to help fuel war between America and ISIS and everything. But the thing is that he tonight was able to lie with just this kind of very strong attitude that makes a lot of people kind of believe him over Hillary. So, for example, she hammers him on how he supported the Iraq War, because he did. Before it happened, he's on tape as having supported. But his response to that is, that hasn't been debunked. I never supported it. And he talks in this way that makes it sound like he's being truthful, and then her response to that is basically, again, there's been fact checking on this, go check the facts. And that doesn't make her look strong, that still makes her look more defensive, and during a debate you want to look like you're the stronger candidate. And even though Trump during this basically said a lot of nothing, he still looked stronger than Hillary.
I'm lowering taxes, actually, because I think it's so important for corporations, because we have corporations leaving, massive corporations and little ones. Little ones can't form. We're getting rid of regulations, which goes hand in hand with the lowering of the taxes. But we're bringing the tax rate down from 35% to 15%. We're cutting taxes for the middle class, and I will tell you, we are cutting them big league for the middle class. And I will tell you, Hillary Clinton is raising your taxes, folks. You can look at me. She's raising your taxes really high.
All right, so Trump talks about his tax plan, and it's standard Republican nonsense about cutting taxes to bring business back in. We need to keep in mind that we had a massive deficit under Bush. Our economy did not grow under him, it shrank. And his tax rates are actually higher. His top tax rate was 35%. Trump's are lower. So he's talking about how that's suddenly somehow gonna, create this great economy for us. It historically just has not happened. And he also talks about cutting regulations. Okay, Trump, we can have a conversation about maybe cutting some regulations. Except then, if you also listen to other things he said about on the same subject, he's talked about cutting 70% of regulations. He's talked about cutting out the FDA food police. I don't know about you, but I want to be able to eat my food without worrying that it's going to kill me at any point, or that the label on what it has in it is accurate. He's also talked about, getting rid of the EPA. These are all things, these are regulations that we kind of need. So you can't just cut regulations completely. You can talk about maybe eliminating some, but Trump consistently talks about cutting way too many. His plans are utterly, nutterly, butterly, and I don't even know where he gets the logic to them.
And there is a determined effort by the Russian Air Force to destroy Aleppo in order to eliminate the last of the Syrian rebels who were really holding out against the Assad regime. Russia hasn't paid any attention to ISIS. They're interested in keeping Assad in power. So when I was Secretary of State, advocated, and I advocate today, a no-fly zone and safe zones. We need some leverage with the Russians because they're not going to come to the negotiating table for a diplomatic resolution unless there is some leverage over them.
So they were asked about their opinions of the situation with the war in Syria. And Hillary Clinton's answer kind of did, not necessarily reveal, since we've kind of known this about her, but, really illustrate that she's not left-wing on a lot of issues. And one of them is foreign policy. And she's very much so of that camp of, making sure you have leverage over these countries, that she's very aggressive towards Russia. I mean, throughout the debate, she was basically accusing Russia of having rigged the election in favor of Trump. So we can tell that if she gets elected, chances are relations with Russia aren't going to get any better anytime soon. And she talks about establishing a no-fly zone and just overall just having this really muscular policy. And that is a very Republican way of talking. So that's when people talk about, and even when she says in her private, donor meetings that she's center-right, that's what people mean, is because in a lot of issues she is right-wing. She does kind of occupy the left on certain more social issues, but when it comes to foreign policy and a lot of, political issues, she's right.
What steps will your energy policy take to meet our energy needs, while at the same time remaining environmentally friendly and minimizing job loss for fossil power plant workers?
Mr. Trump, 2 minutes.
Absolutely. I think it's such a great question.
I agree, Mr. Trump. That is a fantastic question, Mr. Commentator / newfound internet sensation Ken Bone.
Energy is under siege by the Obama administration, under absolute siege. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is killing these energy companies. And foreign companies are now coming in, buying so many of our different plants, and then rejiggering the plant so that they can take care of their oil. We are killing, absolutely killing, our energy business in this country. Now, I'm all for alternative forms of energy, including wind, including solar, etc. But we need much more than wind and solar. And you look at our miners. Hillary Clinton wants to put all the miners out of business.
So, of course, notice what Trump's response lacked. Him actually discussing how to get America more on renewable energy resources. So he talked about, how we need to get back in the coal and all this stuff in order to get jobs back, because China is stealing our coal plants. But amidst this, he mentioned something called clean coal. Now, he said there is something called clean coal, And I actually hadn't heard of this, so I was like, wait, that sounds like, there's some form of coal that just doesn't produce these harmful gases? Why wouldn't we use that? That sounds too good to be true. Well, I looked it up. That's because it is. So what clean coal actually is it's actually a description of a process in which when coal is burned, there's actually the CO2 emissions are actually captured and stored. That's why it's clean, so it's not going into the air. Now the issue is that this has not been used on a large economical scale, and many actual attempts at doing this have ended in failure. So he talks so much about how we need more than solar, more than wind, and he says that there's all these issues with that. He talks about it was in the last debate, I believe it was. He mentioned that windmills kill birds, but he doesn't really care that clean coal has ended in failure. And I assume if we're storing the gases, if that escapes, then there you go. It's kind of out the window at that point. It's not clean coal anymore. So it obviously has these many issues, and it's not really considered economically viable right now. So why aren't we going to solar and wind? As far as I'm concerned, even from an economical standpoint, it just makes sense to do this, because the less and less we're dependent on non-renewable resources, the less money we are going to have to spend with Saudi Arabia getting their oil and being dependent. These renewable resources are available to everyone, and this is obviously not even disregarding the fact that we're on the verge of potentially getting closer and closer to a human extinction event because of climate change, because we keep messing with the environment, we keep pumping out CO2 emissions, and we're not doing enough to curb that. And that's why, as far as I'm concerned, climate change is my number one issue this election. And while I would have certainly loved Bernie to be in office because he, as he said, we need to treat it like a World War II level threat, he didn't end up getting there. And Hillary being what looks like to be the most likely person to win the election, but before it was Trump and Hillary could potentially be it. Hillary's certainly the better one out of those two, because she acknowledges climate change is real, and she discusses, even in private donor meetings, that there is an importance to renewable energy sources. So it leads me to believe that she'll probably do some stuff to move us more towards that. Do I think it's going to be enough? No, probably not. But I think she'll do some stuff. Trump is actively talking about going against that, fighting against what scientists are talking about, and then basically causing the human race to go extinct within 100 years. Well, not necessarily human race go extinct in 100 years, but within 100 years, we're looking at potentially a planet that looks nothing like what it looks like now, with a lot of places just being uninhabitable. The Middle East being too hot for human habitation, for expansion of dead zones in the sea, the ice caps melt, the polar ice caps melting even more, polar bears going extinct. There was recently a report that 4 species of bees that are native to Hawaii are now on the endangered species list. And honey beekeepers in America lost 40% of their bee population. If we lose bees, nothing gets pollinated, we're all screwed. But we're apparently not concerned about that. We need to get more and more coal when we could literally get more jobs and we could get more power by switching to green energy. But it doesn't matter because Trump doesn't care. I don't know if Trump's specifically already being bought off by the oil companies or if he just doesn't know about this. But this is unacceptable for me, and I cannot vote for a candidate who does not acknowledge climate change is real.
First of all, China is illegally dumping steel in the United States, and Donald Trump is buying it to build his buildings, putting steel workers and American steel plants out of business. That's something that I fought against as a senator, and that I would have a trade prosecutor to make sure that we don't get taken advantage of by China on steel or anything else. You know, because it sounds like you're in the business or you're aware of people in the business, you know that we are now for the first time ever energy independent. We are not dependent upon the Middle East, but the Middle East still controls a lot of the prices. So the price of oil has been way down, and that has had a damaging effect on a lot of the oil companies, right? We are, however, producing a lot of natural gas, which serves as a bridge to more renewable fuels, and I think that's an important transition. we've got to remain energy independent. It gives us much more power and freedom than to be worried about what goes on in the Middle East. We have enough worries over there without having to worry about that. So I have a comprehensive energy policy, but it really does include fighting climate change, because I think that is a serious problem. And I support moving toward more clean, renewable energy as quickly as we can, because I think we can be the 21st century clean energy superpower and create millions of new jobs and businesses. But I also want to be sure that we don't leave people behind. That's why I'm the only candidate from the very beginning of this campaign who had a plan to help us revitalize coal country, because those coal miners and their fathers and their grandfathers, they dug that coal out. A lot of them lost their lives, they were injured, but they turned the lights on and they powered our factories. I don't want to walk away from them. So
it was a nice little jab from Hillary at the beginning there, you know, talking about Trump's hypocrisy about how he buys a lot of his foreign products and doesn't give this business, keep his business in the U.S. But specifically about Hillary's rhetoric, this is why I support Hillary over Trump, especially when it comes to climate change, is because she's relatively consistent on that she thinks climate change is a threat. She's not that consistent on how much she's going to do about it, but she's consistent in saying that it's a priority of hers to have a relatively major shift to green energy. Now, in this speech, though, she is a little bit of a, not necessarily a flip-flop, but it kind of goes into her, you know, dual interests about, you know, kind of keeping towards, because unlike Trump, who, you know, I just insinuated might end up might be being bought out or might end up being bought out by oil companies, he's not likely to be being bought out right now, but he'll take the money if they offer it. I guarantee you that. So, but unlike Trump, Hillary, we know she's bought off by the oil companies. This is pretty well documented. So she has those conflicting interests, and it kind of shows in her speech, because she also, while she's talking about how we need to get to green energy and we can be the green energy superpower of the world, she's talking about how we also need to revitalize coal country. And I'm a bit more militant when it comes to climate change than most people, because I think we just need to halt and we need to completely divert our course on how we produce energy and how we treat climate change, because it needs to be a priority and it needs to be done now, because we're doing damage every single day, every single month. It gets hotter and hotter, and we're running out of time. And I feel that when she's talking like this, she's promoting that gradualism, which hasn't worked in many other instances outside of climate change, but is going to lead to a situation where we're doing too little too late for climate change. But at the same time, I'd rather pick too little too late over actively do more to exacerbate the problem. So that was pretty much the debate. There was one last thing I wanted to talk about that was a little bit earlier in the debate, where Trump made a comment. And the reason I wanted to talk about this comment is because this is probably the scariest thing he said in the debate, not except for the climate change thing ultimately in perspective, but this was probably at least the second scariest thing that he said.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Yeah, because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
So I noticed people cheered when Trump said he'd throw her in jail. And, you know, honestly, it disgusts me that it got the response it did. Not because Hillary doesn't necessarily belong in prison, because there's a very real argument that she should. Somebody who did the same thing in her shoes but they weren't they weren't Secretary of State or in some position of power, probably would get into some serious trouble. That's not the issue here. Because Trump's not arguing that because he has a moral or a legal reason to care whether or not Hillary's punished for that. He's doing it because Hillary's his political opponent. So, Why am I saying this? Because Trump's done the same thing. He's taken advantage of his elitist status in order to avoid going to prison and getting in trouble for stuff. He's used charity money to pay off lawsuits. That's illegal. Trump University, that's that's fraud. He hasn't gone to prison over that. It's not as if Trump has never done anything illegal and not suffered the consequences for it. He may have done business in Cuba. You can certainly debate whether or not that's ethically right, because there's a lot of people who disagree with the Cuban trade embargo, and I'm one of them. I think it was ridiculous that we had all these sanctions against Cuba, but he still committed a crime. So he's sitting there talking about how he's going to hire a special prosecutor to go after Hillary. Now, what's a special prosecutor? It's someone who agrees with Trump and is going to put her in prison. Now, what is that? That's a leader imprisoning their political opponents. That is stuff for third world dictatorships. And this is people who, because they're mad at Hillary, because they're mad at the system, they're willing to completely blind themselves to the fact that they're voting for a textbook fascist who's willing to use the system to put away his political opponents. And this is something that people need to think about before they let anger cloud their judgment and they put this madman in power. So, yeah, that was the debate. And as I said earlier in the video, I do think Trump won the debate. Now, I spent a lot of the video yelling at what he said because I think a lot of what he said was dumb, and I think Hillary was a lot better on substance. But the issue is that Hillary just didn't really present herself that well. A lot of her responses to Trump's accusations were either, telling everyone to go fact check it, or saying stuff wasn't true when it was, like when he was going after about the email scandals. The email scandal's true. It happened. And she said that everything he just said is not true. And she got booed for it. There was audible boos from the audience, and Anderson Cooper had to quiet down the audience. So she didn't put on a good performance. And that's the issue. And that's really a lot of what the debate is. Because policy substance can only go so far with most people who don't understand the substance. So a lot of it becomes jargon and it kind of flies over their head. Again, we need to remember that 70% of Americans don't know what the TPP is, or approximately 70%. So a lot of people don't know these things. So it's not just a substance issue, it's how you present yourself. And Trump presented himself as far more aggressive, Hillary was more defensive, and I think that ended up winning him the debate. Now, it should also be stated, Trump had some really, really weird body language this debate. He was kind of a creeper. I don't know, it was very convenient that this was right around the time that the Access Hollywood tapes got leaked, because he was pacing, he was behind Hillary a lot of the time. He just looked very creepy. He was pointing at audience members. It was just weird. He wasn't acting like a normal person. And when the debate first started, I actually started laughing the second I saw him because he did not want to be there. He was pissed. But he ended up pretty much he ended up getting that energy back. So it kind of makes me think of a little bit of a theory that Trump does better when he's down, because then he kind of gets some humility. And he's not, like, when he's just winning, he lets that go to his head. So then he lets himself just talk about the stupidest stuff. And then that's when the meltdowns happen. When he thinks he's at a high, then he just says something and then he melts down. And then he goes back down. But then he mellows out a little bit. And then he kind of puts some more focus back on what his campaign should actually be focused on, which is Hillary is corruption, all this stuff. So it was just an interesting thing to see. But I don't necessarily think it's going to change things much, because I think it might be too little too late for his campaign, but we'll end up seeing he's obviously come back from honestly worse, so we'll end up seeing how if he does have that bounce back.